Hi, everybody. It's the Grouchy Historian. Yes, I've retreated inside, too hot outside. I'm in front of the great filming wall that my honey lamb uses all the time. Let's talk about World War I, the war to end all wars, the Great War, the war that pretty much launched the 20th century and everything else that happened therein and still affects us today. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were two movements going on in Europe, right? At this point, Europe was still pretty much the political and economic center of the world. The United States was a rising power, of course, but we kind of did our own thing. There were two competing schools of thought. One was that the world had become so economically interdependent and connected, dare we say an early version of globalization, that perpetual peace was here to stay. Europe had not experienced a significant war for over 100 years with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And there was this thought that war had become obsolete because it was bad for business. Okay. Second thought was Europe was dividing into two armed camps, right? The powers of Europe had basically split into two different alliances, one comprising England, France, and Russia, the other one comprising Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, with the Ottoman Empire kind of hanging out there somewhere. This was, and these two ideas kind of coexisted up until 1914, right? In 1914, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28th precipitated a crisis in Europe. Now, up until then, the Balkans had been considered, let's just call it what it is, basically the hillbillies of Europe, pain in the butt, nobody wanted to deal with them. And certainly they were not considered worth going to war over. There had been a couple of Balkan wars in the 3 or 4 years before the First World War, but they hadn't involved all the European powers. However, the assassination of the Archduke precipitated a crisis first between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, then between Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia, and then between Germany, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia. Okay, the thing you have to keep in mind here, why did World War I occur? Well, in a large part it occurred because the militaries were very inflexible, right? This was the age of great industrial militaries of millions of men moved by railroads, and once mobilization started, it couldn't be stopped. The militaries all had basically one plan for war that involved taking over the entire railroad system of the country, and once they saw their foe mobilizing, they were going to mobilize, and they were going to go to war. And that's pretty much how Barbara Tuchman describes it in her book. Or if you've ever read the myriad of new books coming out discussing the origins of World War I, a lot of that was just simply driven by the military timetables and military mobilization plans. So let's quickly go through year by year, sort of the big events, because, again, trivia time, big events. In 1914, the Germans invaded France through Belgium. Critical mistake. By going through Belgium, they involved the British in the war. And the Germans almost won the war by September by capturing Paris. However, they were turned back at the First Battle of the Marne, and Paris was saved. And the Germans and the British and French had what was known as the race to the sea to try to outflank their opponents and end the war. Well, the war did not end in 1914, right? Otherwise, in the Eastern Front, which I think a lot of people have not studied but is equally important, the Germans and Russians and Austrians went to war. A little more room to maneuver there because of the very vast distances. But again, the war sort of reached a stalemate there after a couple of big German victories early in the war. 1915 really brought home the horrors of what World War I would be. World War I was basically a war of firepower. The new invention called the machine gun, combined with the entrenching tool and barbed wire, created two vast trench networks along the Western Front that pretty much, give or take a couple of miles, stayed where they were throughout the entire war, right? The machine gun was a new tactical invention that kind of became a strategic weapon and ended the era of the massed infantry assault, okay? So throughout 1915, the war on the Western Front remains stalemated, okay? The war on the Eastern Front maneuvers back and forth, but no side can really get an advantage because both sides assumed that if there was a war, it would be very short. They were not prepared for a long war where they had to mobilize their entire society, industrial, financial, economic, and manpower to fight a war that, a single battle could have hundreds of thousands of casualties, right? So 1915 ends inconclusively. 1916 starts. This is probably the bloodiest year of the war, certainly on the Western Front, with the two great battles of Verdun and the Somme that end up just causing hundreds of thousands of casualties, churn the ground into like this hellhole of mud, and end up basically where they started. On the Eastern Front, we start to see the Russian army begin to fall apart because of ineptness and just a simple lack of logistics. And the same thing with the Austria-Hungarians, right? The Austria-Hungarians were sort of a weak link in the alliance. Interestingly enough, in 1915, the Italians decided to come in on the war on the side of the Allies, which I found fascinating. But again, they don't make much progress against the Austrians. It's sort of this weird situation where the Austrians can't seem to defeat the Russians, but they can kick the Italians' butts, right? Also, the Ottoman Empire comes into the war as well. So now you see fighting in the Middle East between the British and the Ottomans in what is now Iraq and what is now Israel, okay? So 1916 has one intriguing possibility, right? This is what's fascinating about history, is history is always changing and there's always something new to learn. I read a recent book that said there was a genuine possibility that in 1916, Woodrow Wilson, if he had been on his game, could have negotiated an end to the war, right? Now, there's been there was sort of this notion that once the Allies got so far into the war, and the Central Powers, as they were called, they couldn't get out because they had expended so much blood and treasure that only victory would satisfy their populace. This is not true, right? By the middle of 1916, all of the powers of Europe pretty much realized that they were in a stalemate, that they did not have the military or economic power to overwhelm their opponent and enforce their own peace on them. So Wilson had the possibility of enforcing what he called peace without victory. He had a particular amount of leverage over the British and French because we were financing them, right? It's all about the Benjamins. The British and French economies would have collapsed without American loans and American war material to keep the war going. The Germans, of course, were just as willing to negotiate a peace because they were starving. They'd been blockaded for 2 years. Unfortunately, Wilson's own ineptness and the election of 1916 kept him from pushing for peace in that summer of 1916 when it was a tantalizing possibility. And once 1917 came about, the powers decided that they were no longer interested. And of course, in early 1917, we see the Russians fall out of the war with the overthrow of the Tsar and the beginning of the Russian Revolution. And then, of course, the most critical factor of 1917 was the entrance of the U.S. into the war on April 6th, after the Germans had unleashed a new weapon called the submarine, or the U-boat, as the Germans called it, on naval warfare. The U-boat almost ended the war on its own by cutting off the merchant ship traffic to England, but the Germans had this nasty habit of attacking American merchant ships, which gave Wilson his excuse to bring the U.S. into the war. Now, the entrance of the U.S. to the war was decisive, but not for almost a year. The U.S. was so unprepared for war that even though we had lots of troops, we didn't have a lot of weapons. We actually ended up fighting most of the First World War with British rifles, French machine guns, and French aircraft, and French artillery, and French tanks. Not good for American industry, but we simply had not been at war. We had not mobilized our economy. Eventually, we did provide a great deal of munitions, but for the most part, American troops fought World War I with British and French weapons. But the intervention of American troops was decisive. After the Russians fell out of the war because of the Revolution, the Germans were able to shift most of their troops from the Eastern Front for one last great offensive effort in France. But by that time, the American army had started to arrive. The Americans, British, French were able to stop that final German counteroffensive and launch their own called the 100 Days in the late summer of 1918. This was the decisive campaign of the war, knocked the Germans out of the war, forced the Germans to sue for an armistice. We'll talk about that in just a second. And of course, after the end of the war, you see the four great dynasties of Europe fall: the Germans, Austrians, Ottomans, and Russians. So why is this important? Well, a couple of reasons. Obviously, the rise of communism would inflict a great deal of misery on the rest of the 20th century, right? And think about it. If that peace treaty of 1916 had been signed, there's a decent chance that even if the Tsar had not survived, which he might have been able to, but certainly it would not have given the impetus to bring the communists to power. And it's possible a Russian democracy could have survived. Interesting possibility. That's why history is so fascinating to study. The other thing, of course, is the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire brought about by a secret treaty signed by the British and French. Don't kid yourselves. The British and French took care of themselves in World War I, called the Sykes-Picot Treaty, broke up the Arab portions of the Ottoman Empire, the modern countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and most importantly, Palestine, soon to be called Israel, was, let's call it a cynical carving up of the booty of war, so to speak. But what it ended up doing is a couple of things. First, the British had induced the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. If anybody ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, right? They sort of betrayed them. Well, they didn't sort of. They did. They betrayed them, right? And they absorbed them into the British and French empires instead of granting them independence. Second thing, the way they sort of carved up these countries, you have this polyglot of ethnic and religious groups. Let's just take Iraq with the Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and Shia Arabs that don't really like each other. Now they're all mashed together in a country and called, boom, you're Iraqis. This didn't work well. It didn't work well 100 years later when the U.S. Invaded Iraq in 2003. We'll talk about that in another video. So you had this carving up of the Ottoman Empire, which set the stage for pretty much everything else that happened in the Middle East for the rest of the 20th century, particularly the creation of what would eventually become a homeland for the Jewish people, particularly after World War II and the Holocaust. And you also had the rise of communism in Russia. The other thing you had was Germany was not necessarily defeated in World War I. They signed an armistice, but their territory was never occupied. Their army was never actually defeated. The Kaiser abdicated, but the German government went on. Now, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, bringing a peace, it wasn't really a peace per se. It did a couple of things. Number one, it blamed everything that happened on Germany, which, as history has shown, is a little unfair. There was a lot of blame to go around. The Germans bore a good share of the responsibility, but the Russians, and let's just call it what it was, the French and the British, they were all victims of their own diplomatic and military circumstances and plans. The other thing that it did was it set the stage by carving up what was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the modern states, or what would become the modern states of Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, right? You wonder why the late 1990s were such a mess in Yugoslavia. Well, Yugoslavia was mashed together from Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, again, a bunch of people that were ethnically and religiously different and didn't really like each other very much. But, of course, the other critical factor in World War I is it brought America onto the stage as a world power, albeit a very reluctant one, right? The U.S. did what we had to do, ended the war. Wilson tried to dominate the peace treaty afterwards, but really he was out of his league. And the U.S. started having to grapple with how involved it was going to be in the affairs of Europe and the world, right? Traditionally, we had followed George Washington's very smart admonition to avoid foreign entanglements and alliances. Unfortunately, it was becoming clear to a great many American politicians and deep thinkers that this was no longer really possible. And you would certainly see that with the rise of the military aircraft, that the oceans no longer provided this great moat of protection around the United States. But we struggled with how we wanted to deal with the aftermath of the European war. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next video. where we look at World War I and World War II sort of as a continuum, right? There's some historians that have called it the 30 Years' War of the 20th century. If you go back to the period between 1618 and 1648, there was a huge war in Europe, again, motivated primarily for dynastic and religious reasons, that ended up with the utter destruction of Germany after the 30 Years' War. Strangely enough, so 300 years later, after the end of World War II. So there's sort of a thought that one of the ways to do a better examination of World War I is to look at World War I and World War II as sort of a continuum, and how many of the decisions made both in the Treaty of Versailles and in other diplomatic circles after the end of the First World War kind of really drove the causes of the Second World War. So that's the First World War, kind of in a nutshell, right? Again, if you've ever read Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August, fabulous book. John F. Kennedy read it during the Cuban Missile Crisis as sort of a how-to guide of what not to do in a crisis, right? Another great book is Eden to Armageddon, looks at World War I in the Middle East. Again, I think a lot of people don't realize how much of the current issues in the Middle East have come out of the First World War. And then, great series, I think I've talked about this before. This is by a young historian named Nick Floyd. He's writing a trilogy on World War I. This is the first volume that kind of looks at history on the Western Front of World War I a little more holistically. Really great book. Goes through things at a little bit higher view to bring a little more context to things. And then, of course, there are some decent one-volume histories, right? The Great War by Peter Hart is sort of a one-volume history of the First World War as well. So that's the First World War. Went over a little bit, so hopefully didn't bore you to death. And yeah, the First World War, pretty much the scene setter for all the bad things that happened in the 20th century. See you next time.